When most people think about medieval romance, they picture a knight in shining armor riding up to a castle tower and rescuing a beautiful princess. Maybe he slays a dragon first. Maybe he writes her poetry and sings songs under her window while playing a lute. And look, some of that stuff did happen, but the reality of how medieval courtship actually worked was way more complicated and honestly kind of wild when you really dig into it. The thing you have to understand first is that marriage in medieval times was almost never about love. I know that sounds harsh, but it is just the truth. For noble families, marriage was a business deal. It was about land. It was about money. It was about forming alliances between powerful families. If you were a lord with a daughter, you were basically sitting on an asset that you could trade to another family in exchange for political support or territory or wealth. The daughter herself often had very little say in who she was going to marry. Now, this does not mean that romance did not exist. It absolutely did. But romance and marriage were often two completely separate things in medieval society. A knight might be deeply in love with a lady who was already married to someone else. And that was actually considered normal and even celebrated in the literature of the time. We will get more into that later because the whole concept of courtly love is fascinating and strange. But let us start at the beginning. How did people even meet each other in medieval times? There were no dating apps, obviously. There was no way to just casually bump into someone at a coffee shop. For peasants, you basically married someone from your village or a nearby village because those were the only people you ever saw. Your parents probably arranged it with their parents, and that was that. Not a lot of romance involved for most common people. For the nobility, though, there were actually quite a few opportunities to meet potential partners. The most important one was the tournament. Tournaments were massive events where knights would compete in jousting and sword fighting and other martial contests. They were kind of like the sporting events of their time, and they drew huge crowds. Ladies would attend to watch the fighting, and this gave knights a chance to show off and catch the eye of a woman they admired. And knights took this very seriously. They would wear a lady's favor into battle, which was usually a scarf or a ribbon or some piece of clothing that she had given him. If she had not given him anything, he might just wear her colors anyway to show that he was fighting in her honor. The whole point was to be noticed. A knight who won a tournament could approach a lady afterward, and she would probably at least talk to him because he had proven himself to be skilled and brave. Feasts and banquets were another big opportunity. Noble families threw these events all the time, and they were a chance for young people to mingle under the supervision of their parents. There would be music and dancing, and a knight could ask a lady to dance with him. Dancing was actually a really important part of courtship because it was one of the few times when a man and woman could touch each other and have a conversation without everyone freaking out about it. Hunting parties were also popular. The nobility loved to hunt, and these expeditions would often last for days. Men and women would ride out together into the forest, and there were opportunities for private conversations while tracking deer or whatever they were after. A lot of early flirting probably happened during these hunts. Now here is where things get interesting. Even if a knight met a lady and was attracted to her, he could not just walk up and ask her out. There were very strict rules about how courtship was supposed to happen, and breaking these rules could ruin your reputation, or worse. The whole system was based on the idea that women were supposed to be modest and men were supposed to be respectful. And there was an elaborate dance that had to happen before anything could progress. The first step was usually to find a way to let the lady know you were interested without being too obvious about it. This is where poetry came in. Knights would write poems praising a lady's beauty and virtue, and then they would find a way to get these poems to her. Sometimes they would recite them at a feast. Sometimes they would have a friend deliver them. Sometimes they would sing them, because a lot of medieval poetry was meant to be set to music. And these poems were not subtle at all. They were full of exaggerated praise about how the lady was the most beautiful woman in the world, and how the knight would die without her love, and how he was her humble servant forever. It sounds over the top to us now, but this was totally normal and expected at the time. If you wanted to court a lady, you had to be willing to put yourself out there and make big romantic gestures. The concept behind all of this was something called courtly love, and it shaped medieval romance in a huge way. Courtly love was basically a set of rules and expectations about how a nobleman should pursue a woman. It originated in the courts of southern France in the 1100s and spread throughout Europe over the next few centuries. The basic idea was that love was supposed to be ennobling. Being in love with a lady was supposed to make you a better knight. It was supposed to inspire you to do great deeds and to be more virtuous. But here is the weird part. Courtly love was almost always directed at a woman who was already married. This was not considered problematic. In fact, it was kind of the whole point. The love was supposed to be pure precisely because it could never be fulfilled. A knight would worship his lady from afar, perform great deeds in her name, and suffer the exquisite pain of wanting someone he could never truly have. This was seen as beautiful and romantic. Now, did knights actually sleep with these married women? Sometimes, yes, definitely. The literature of the time is full of stories about secret affairs and sneaking into bedchambers and all that. But officially, courtly love was supposed to be chaste. It was about devotion and service, not physical satisfaction. Whether people actually followed these rules or not is another question entirely. The rules of courtly love were actually written down in various texts. One of the most famous is a book called The Art of Courtly Love, written by a guy named Andreas Capellanus, around the year 1185. In this book, he lays out specific guidelines for how love should work. He says that a true lover is always thinking about his beloved. He says that jealousy is a necessary part of love. He says that the lover should turn pale whenever he sees his lady. There are dozens of these rules, and they paint a picture of love as this intense, all-consuming experience that takes over your entire life. One of the interesting things about courtly love is that it gave women a kind of power they did not have in most other areas of medieval life. In the courtly love dynamic, the lady was the one in control. The knight was supposed to serve her and obey her wishes. If she told him to go on a quest or perform some feat, he was supposed to do it. If she rejected him, he was supposed to accept that rejection gracefully and continue to serve her anyway. This was a reversal of the normal power dynamics where men controlled pretty much everything. Some historians think that courtly love was basically a game that noblewomen used to exercise influence in a male-dominated world. By encouraging knights to worship them and compete for their favor, they could manipulate these men and gain political power indirectly. Whether this was really the case, or whether courtly love was more of a literary invention that did not reflect real behavior, is still debated by scholars. Let us talk about what the actual process of courting someone looked like if you were trying to get married rather than just participating in the courtly love game. Say you are a young knight and you have your eye on a lady from a good family. The first thing you would do is try to get an introduction from someone who knew both of you. Cold approaches were not really a thing. You needed someone to vouch for you and to make the introduction seem natural and appropriate. Once you had met the lady, you would start trying to spend time around her at social events. You would make conversation, but always in the presence of others, because being alone with an unmarried woman would damage her reputation. You might bring her small gifts like flowers or sweets. You might write her poetry or dedicate tournament victories to her, All of this was meant to show that you were interested without being inappropriately forward. If the lady seemed receptive to your attention, the next step was to approach her father or whoever was the head of her family. This is because the decision about marriage was not really hers to make. You would basically be asking for permission to court her formally, and the family would consider whether you were a suitable match. They would look at your wealth, your land, your family connections, your reputation. If you passed muster, they might give you permission to continue pursuing her. Formal courtship involved a lot more contact between the couple, but still under strict supervision. They might be allowed to walk together in gardens or sit next to each other at meals. The lady's family would be watching the whole time to make sure nothing inappropriate happened. During this period, the couple was supposed to be getting to know each other and deciding if they wanted to proceed to marriage. Gift giving was a huge part of this process. Knights would give their ladies all kinds of presents to show their devotion. Jewelry was popular, especially rings and brooches. Books were also common gifts because they were expensive and showed that the giver was cultured and educated. Gloves were another traditional gift, and there was a whole symbolic language around what different gifts meant. Some gifts were considered promises of marriage, so you had to be careful about what you gave and when. Love tokens were a special category of gifts. These were objects that served as symbols of the relationship between two people. A lady might give a knight a lock of her hair tied with a ribbon. She might give him her sleeve or her veil to wear as a favor. In return, he might give her a ring or a brooch. These tokens were supposed to be kept close to the body and treasured. Losing a love token or giving it away was considered a serious betrayal. Letters were another important part of courtship, at least for people who could read and write. Noble couples would exchange letters that were often quite romantic and personal. Some of these letters have survived, and they give us a fascinating look at medieval relationships. The letters of Heloise and Abelard from the 1100s are probably the most famous, and they show a deep and passionate love between two people who were eventually separated by circumstances. Now let us talk about what was expected from the lady in all of this. Her role was supposed to be passive, at least on the surface. She was supposed to be modest and virtuous and to resist a knight's advances at first. Giving in too quickly would make her seem loose or immoral. The proper thing to do was to make the knight work for her affection. She should be cold and distant for a while before gradually warming up to him. But this does not mean women had no agency. Within the game of courtship, they had a lot of power to accept or reject suitors. A lady could encourage a knight with smiles and kind words, or she could shut him down completely by refusing to speak with him or by ignoring his gifts. She could string along multiple suitors at once, playing them against each other. Some women became quite skilled at using courtship to their advantage. Ladies were also expected to test their suitors to prove that their love was genuine. This is where the whole concept of quests and feats comes from. A lady might tell a knight that she would only accept his love if he won a certain tournament, or if he went on a pilgrimage to a holy site, or if he performed some other difficult task. The knight was supposed to accept these challenges eagerly because completing them proved his devotion. The most extreme version of this was the concept of the knight-errant, who would wander the land looking for adventures to complete in his lady's name. These knights would fight other knights, rescue people in distress, and perform all kinds of heroic deeds, all to prove their worthiness to a woman back home. Whether this actually happened much in real life or was mainly a literary invention is hard to say. But the idea was very popular in medieval stories. Let us talk about some of the more unusual courtship practices that existed in medieval Europe. In some parts of the continent, there was a tradition called bundling, where a courting couple would be allowed to spend the night together in the same bed but fully clothed and often with a board placed between them. The idea was that this allowed them to get to know each other in a private setting while technically preserving the woman's virtue. How well this worked in practice is anyone's guess. In other places, there were night courting traditions where young men would visit young women at their bedroom windows after dark. They would talk through the window and sometimes climb inside for a visit. These meetings were technically forbidden but widely tolerated as a normal part of courtship. The woman's family would pretend not to notice as long as things did not go too far. Music and singing were huge parts of medieval courtship. If you could play an instrument and sing, you had a major advantage in wooing a lady. Troubadours were professional poet-musicians who specialized in love songs, and they were extremely popular in medieval courts. Young knights often learned to play instruments specifically so they could serenade ladies. The lute and the harp were especially associated with romance. The songs themselves were often about unrequited love and the pain of separation from one's beloved. They used elaborate metaphors comparing the lady to roses and stars and other beautiful things. They talked about dying from love and about being a slave to passion. This style of love poetry influenced European literature for centuries and is the ancestor of the love songs we still listen to today. Dancing was another skill that every knight needed to master. Medieval dances were elaborate affairs with specific steps that everyone was supposed to know. They often involved partners holding hands or linking arms, which was one of the few acceptable ways for unmarried people to touch each other in public. Being a good dancer made you more attractive as a potential partner and gave you opportunities to flirt during the dance. Now let us talk about what happened when courtship was successful and a couple decided to get married. The first step was usually a formal betrothal, which was a promise to marry in the future. This was a legally binding agreement that was almost as serious as the marriage itself. Breaking a betrothal could result in lawsuits and social disgrace. The betrothal usually happened in front of witnesses and was often marked by the exchange of rings. After the betrothal, there would be negotiations between the families about the terms of the marriage. This included the dowry, which was the money and property that the bride's family would give to the groom. It also included the dower, which was the property that the groom promised to give the bride if he died before her. These negotiations could take months and sometimes fell apart if the families could not agree on terms. The wedding itself was a public ceremony that had both religious and legal significance. The couple would exchange vows in front of a priest and witnesses. There would usually be a feast afterward with lots of food and drink and entertainment. The whole community was expected to attend and celebrate with the couple. But here is the thing. Consent was required for a marriage to be valid according to church law. Both the man and the woman had to agree to the marriage of their own free will. This might seem like it contradicts what I said earlier about arranged marriages, but the reality was complicated. Yes, parents arranged marriages. Yes, young people often had little choice in the matter, but they still had to stand up in front of a priest and say that they agreed to the marriage. If someone was being forced into a marriage against their will, they could technically refuse. In practice, refusing a marriage that your parents had arranged was extremely difficult. You would be going against your entire family and potentially losing their support forever. Most people just went along with whatever match their parents made for them, even if they were not happy about it. But the requirement of consent did give people some protection, and there are records of marriages being annulled because one party claimed they had been forced into it. Love could develop after marriage, even if it was not present at the beginning. Medieval people understood this, and there was an expectation that spouses should treat each other with affection and respect. A husband was supposed to be kind to his wife. A wife was supposed to be loyal to her husband. They were supposed to work together to manage their household and raise their children. Many couples who married as strangers ended up developing genuine love for each other over time. But what about affairs and adultery? This was a constant problem in medieval society. People who were married off to strangers often found themselves falling in love with someone else. Adultery was technically a serious crime that could be punished harshly. In some places, an adulterous wife could be killed by her husband without any legal consequences. In practice, though, affairs happened all the time among the nobility. As long as they were discreet and did not result in scandal, people often looked the other way. The whole system of courtly love existed partly because it gave people an outlet for romantic feelings that they could not express within their marriages. A knight could worship a married lady from afar and write poems about his undying love for her. And this was considered acceptable as long as they did not actually consummate the relationship. It was a way of having romance without technically committing adultery. Let us talk about some specific examples of medieval courtship from historical records. One of the most famous love stories from medieval England is that of John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford. John was the son of King Edward III and one of the most powerful men in England. Catherine was the governess of his children by his first wife. They fell in love and carried on an affair for years while John was married to his second wife. Eventually, after his second wife died, John married Catherine in what was considered a scandal because she was so far below him in social status. But they seemed to genuinely love each other, and John legitimized all the children they had had together. Another interesting example is the marriage of Marjorie Paston and Richard Cale in 15th century England. Marjorie was from a wealthy gentry family, and Richard was a servant in her household. They fell in love and secretly got betrothed without her family's permission. When her family found out, they were furious and tried to break up the relationship. But because Marjorie and Richard had exchanged vows in the presence of witnesses, the church ruled that they were legally married and there was nothing the family could do about it. Marjorie's family never forgave her and essentially cut her off. These stories show us that love could and did happen in medieval times, but it often came at a high cost when it went against the wishes of families. People who married for love against their family's wishes risked losing everything: their inheritance, their social standing, their relationships with relatives. The pressure to conform to arranged marriages was enormous. Let us talk about some of the symbols and objects associated with medieval courtship. Rings were probably the most important. The exchange of rings was a central part of both betrothal and marriage, and rings given during courtship were symbols of serious intent. The ring finger was believed to have a vein that ran directly to the heart, which is why we still wear wedding rings on that finger today. The heart symbol that we associate with love today was already being used in medieval times, though it looked slightly different than the stylized version we know now. Hearts appeared on jewelry, in art, and in manuscripts as symbols of love and devotion. Couples gave each other heart-shaped pendants and brooches. Flowers had their own language of meaning. Red roses symbolized passionate love. White roses meant purity. Violets represented faithfulness. A knight might send a specific arrangement of flowers to convey a message to his lady. This tradition of flower meanings continued for centuries and was still going strong in the Victorian era. Colors also had symbolic significance. Red was the color of passion and love. Blue represented faithfulness and constancy. Green was associated with new love and hope. Knights and ladies would wear colors to communicate their romantic status or to honor a particular person. Love knots were decorative patterns that symbolized the bond between lovers. They appeared on clothing, jewelry, and household objects. The idea was that true love was like a knot that could not be untied. Giving someone an object decorated with a love knot was a way of saying that you wanted to be bound to them forever. Now let us talk about what could go wrong during courtship. Rejection was always a possibility, and it could be humiliating. If a knight pursued a lady and she turned him down, everyone would know about it. The social world of medieval nobility was very small and very gossipy. News traveled fast, and a rejected suitor might become the subject of mockery. Interference from families was another common problem. Even if two people liked each other, their families might have other plans for them. Parents often made marriage agreements when their children were very young, sometimes when they were still babies. By the time the children grew up, they might already be promised to someone they had never met. Misunderstandings and miscommunication could also cause problems. The elaborate, indirect nature of courtly courtship meant that there was a lot of room for signals to get crossed. A lady might think a knight was just being polite when he was actually trying to express romantic interest. A knight might interpret a lady's friendliness as encouragement when she meant nothing romantic by it. Rivals were a constant concern. If you were courting a desirable lady, chances were that other men were too. Competition could get fierce, and it sometimes led to duels or other violent confrontations. There are plenty of medieval stories about knights fighting each other over the same woman. Scandal could ruin everything. If a couple was caught in a compromising situation before marriage, it could destroy both of their reputations. The woman would suffer more than the man, as she would be seen as damaged goods and might become unmarriageable. Families went to great lengths to supervise courtship and prevent any opportunities for scandal. Death was also a factor. Life was dangerous in medieval times, and people died young all the time. A promising courtship might end suddenly if one party died of disease, or if a knight was killed in battle. Women also frequently died in childbirth, which meant that many men outlived multiple wives and had to go through the courtship process more than once. Let us talk about how courtship differed depending on your social class. For the high nobility, marriages were affairs of state. Princes and princesses married to cement alliances between kingdoms. Their personal feelings were completely irrelevant. These marriages were negotiated by diplomats and could take years to arrange. The couple might never meet until their wedding day. For the lower nobility and gentry, there was slightly more flexibility. Families still arranged marriages, but they might allow young people some input into the decision. A daughter might be allowed to reject a particular suitor if she really objected to him, as long as she was willing to accept someone else from an approved list. For the merchant and professional classes in cities, courtship started to look more like what we might recognize today. These families still wanted their children to marry well, but they were not dealing with vast lands and political alliances. They might allow their children to court more freely and to have more say in choosing their partners. For peasants, courtship was the most informal. Young people in villages had many opportunities to meet and interact with each other during work and festivals. They might fall in love and decide to marry with relatively little interference from their families. The stakes were lower because there was less property involved. A peasant marriage was mostly about finding someone to work alongside you and raise children with. Let us discuss the Church's role in all of this. The medieval Catholic Church had very specific rules about marriage and courtship. Marriage was a sacrament, a holy ritual that could only be performed by a priest. The Church prohibited marriage between close relatives and required that marriages be announced publicly before they took place, so that anyone with an objection could come forward. The Church also taught that sex was only acceptable within marriage and that its purpose was procreation, not pleasure. This created a tension with the ideals of courtly love, which celebrated passion and desire. The church authorities often criticized the troubadours and their love songs as promoting sinful attitudes toward love and sex. At the same time, the church was the institution that enforced the consent requirement for marriage. Church courts heard cases where people claimed they had been forced to marry against their will. The church's position was that a valid marriage required the free consent of both parties, which actually gave women some protection against the worst excesses of arranged marriage. The church also recognized secret marriages, which caused all kinds of problems. If two people exchanged vows in the presence of witnesses, even without a priest, the church might rule that they were legally married. This led to situations like the Marjorie Paston case I mentioned earlier, where families found themselves stuck with marriages they had never approved. Let us wrap up by talking about what we can learn from medieval courtship and how it compares to romance today. The biggest difference is obviously that we no longer treat marriage as a business transaction between families. Most people in the modern Western world choose their own partners based on love and compatibility. We would find the idea of being married off to a stranger deeply disturbing. But some things have not changed as much as we might think. The desire to impress a potential partner, the nervousness of early courtship, the exchange of gifts and tokens of affection, the pain of rejection, these are all things that people still experience today. Medieval people felt all of these same emotions. They were not so different from us in their desires and fears when it came to love. The concept of romantic love that we take for granted today was actually developed during the medieval period. The troubadours and their love songs, the ideals of courtly love, the stories of knights and ladies, all of this created a template for romance that we are still following. When you see a movie about two people falling in love against all odds, you are seeing a story type that was invented in medieval Europe. Of course, there were many problems with medieval courtship that we are better off without. Women had very little autonomy and were often treated as property to be traded between families. Love and marriage were considered separate things, which meant that many people spent their whole lives in loveless marriages. The rigid class system meant that love across class boundaries was almost impossible. We have made a lot of progress since then, but romance is still complicated. People still struggle with how to meet partners and how to express their feelings. Dating apps have replaced tournaments as the place where people try to catch each other's attention. We write text messages instead of poems, but we are still trying to communicate the same things. The forms have changed, but the underlying human need for love and connection has stayed exactly the same. Medieval courtship was a strange mix of business negotiation, elaborate ritual, and genuine emotion. It was constrained by social rules that seemed absurd to us now. But within those constraints, people still found ways to love each other. They wrote poetry and sang songs and danced together and exchanged tokens of their affection. They suffered from unrequited love and rejoiced when their feelings were returned. They were human beings doing the best they could within the system they were born into. And that is really all any of us are doing, trying to find love and connection within whatever constraints our society puts on us. The constraints have changed, but the goal is still the same. Every generation figures out its own rules for courtship, and then the next generation comes along and changes everything. Medieval people would probably find our dating habits just as bizarre as we find theirs. So the next time you see a movie about a knight rescuing a princess and winning her love, remember that the reality was way more complicated than that. Real medieval courtship involved negotiations between families, years of formal procedures, elaborate poetic conventions, and strict rules about what men and women could do together. But underneath all of that, people were still just trying to find someone to love. That part has never changed and probably never will. One thing I did not mention yet is the role of matchmakers in medieval courtship. In many communities, there were people whose job it was to bring compatible couples together. These matchmakers knew all the families in an area, knew who had eligible sons and daughters, knew who had money and who needed it. They would suggest matches and help negotiate the terms. For their services, they received a fee, usually a percentage of the dowry or a flat payment from one or both families. Matchmaking was especially important in Jewish communities in medieval Europe, where it developed into a formal profession. The matchmaker, called a shadchan in Hebrew, would travel between towns, meeting with families and keeping mental records of all the eligible young people. When they found a good match, they would bring the families together and help them work out the details. This tradition continued for centuries and still exists in some Orthodox Jewish communities today. In other cultures within medieval Europe, matchmaking worked differently. In some places, older women in the community took on this role informally. They would keep track of who was courting whom and offer advice to young people and their parents. In other places, priests or monks might help arrange marriages as part of their pastoral duties. The actual moment of proposing marriage looked quite different from what we see today. There was no getting down on one knee with a diamond ring. Instead, the proposal was usually handled through intermediaries. A knight interested in marriage would have a family member or trusted friend approach the lady's family to inquire whether a match might be possible. Only if the answer was encouraging would the knight himself become more directly involved. When a formal proposal was made, it often came in the form of a written document laying out the terms of the proposed marriage. This included details about the dowry, the dower, where the couple would live, and other practical matters. Romance was not really part of this stage. It was pure business negotiation. The proposal might also include gifts to sweeten the deal. These gifts went to the lady's family, not just to her personally. A wealthy suitor might offer horses or jewelry or even land as part of his proposal package. The richer you were, the more you were expected to offer. This made marriage proposals into a kind of bidding war among wealthy families competing for the most desirable marchés. If the proposal was accepted, there would be a formal betrothal ceremony. This was a big event with witnesses from both families. The couple would exchange rings and make promises to marry each other in the future. From this point on, they were considered bound to each other, almost as if they were already married. Breaking a betrothal was a serious matter that could result in legal action. The time between betrothal and marriage could vary a lot. Sometimes couples married within weeks of becoming betrothed. Other times, especially if they were young, they might wait years. During this waiting period, they were expected to be faithful to each other but were not supposed to live together or have sex. Whether everyone followed these rules is another question. I also want to talk about what happened when courtship went wrong in really bad ways. Unfortunately, violence against women was common in medieval times, and some men used force to get what they wanted when courtship did not work out for them. There are records of women being kidnapped and forced into marriage by men who could not win their consent any other way. This was technically illegal, but enforcement was spotty and powerful men often got away with it. Women who were raped sometimes ended up having to marry their attackers. The twisted logic was that a woman who had lost her virginity was damaged goods and no one else would want her, so she might as well marry the man who ruined her. The church sometimes encouraged these marriages as a way of making things right. It is a horrifying example of how little autonomy women had in this period. On a lighter note, let us talk about some of the more playful aspects of medieval courtship. Young people found ways to have fun even within the strict rules of their society. There were games and contests designed to bring couples together. May Day celebrations often included rituals where young men and women were paired up, sometimes by chance and sometimes through contests. Mock courts of love were a popular entertainment among the nobility. These were gatherings where questions about love and courtship were debated as if they were legal cases. A panel of noble ladies would hear arguments and render verdicts on questions, like whether it was better to have a lover who was jealous or one who was indifferent. These debates were meant to be entertaining, but they also reinforced the rules and expectations of courtly love. Fortune-telling and divination were also popular tools for anxious lovers. Young women would try to divine the name of their future husband through various rituals. They might peel an apple and throw the peel over their shoulder, then see what letter it formed when it landed. They might put certain herbs under their pillow to dream of their future spouse. These practices were technically frowned upon by the church, but were widespread anyway. The exchange of love poetry was not just one way. While knights were famous for writing poems to their ladies, women also wrote and exchanged verses. Some of the most beautiful medieval love poetry was written by women, though their work often survived less well because it was not taken as seriously by later generations. The poems women wrote give us a glimpse into how they experienced love and courtship from their side of the equation. One final thing worth mentioning is how medieval ideas about courtship were shaped by the literature people read and the stories they heard. Just like today, people in medieval times learned about romance partly through fiction. The stories of King Arthur and his knights, the tales of Tristan and Isolde, the romances that troubadours performed. All of these shaped what people thought love was supposed to look like. Fiction and reality influenced each other in complicated ways. Real knights tried to live up to the ideals they saw in stories about courtly love. At the same time, the stories were based on real behaviors that the authors observed around them. It is hard to separate what was real practice from what was literary invention. Probably the truth is somewhere in the middle, with literature both reflecting and shaping how people actually behaved. So that is the story of medieval courtship. It was complicated and strange and sometimes beautiful and sometimes cruel. It was shaped by economic concerns and family politics and religious rules and literary traditions. But at its heart, it was about people trying to connect with each other and find love. That is something we can all understand, no matter how much these specific practices have changed.